Okay. Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the Emancipatory Futures Studies platform. The Emancipatory Futures Studies project is based at Wits University. I'm its principal investigator. My name is Vishwas Satka. It's been around since 2019, and we've had several thrusts in our work. We've been trying to think differently about temporalities and time. We've been trying to think about decolonial futures, emancipatory futures in history, systemic pathways into the future, utopia, dystopia, grand ecocentric futures. And we've explored various themes, topics, praxis around emancipatory futures on this platform. Today, we're breaking ground on a very, very important theme, consumerism, sustainability, and happiness. What is enough in our current world? Generally, within sort of progressive and emancipatory left thought, there's been a lot of emphasis on the production side of things. We have really grappled with alternative ways of living that, if you like, elaborates an alternative approach to consumption and being. We have lifestyle green politics. There is a prominent discourse on degrowth, particularly in the global north. But I think it's important that we go deeper to try and understand issues around how do we live with what is enough. And to help us think this through today, we have Cynthia Kaufman. Cynthia Kaufman is the director of the Vasconcelos Institute for Democracy in Action at De Anza College, where she runs and teaches in a community organizer training program. She's the author of 5 books on social change, consumerism, sustainability, and happiness. And she'll be talking to this particular text today. The sea is rising, and so are we. Challenging power, democracy, and accountability in a fractured world, getting past capitalism, which I have, by the way, and ideas for action. She has been active in a wide variety of social justice movements, most recently working on the climate crisis. Over to you, Cynthia. You
All
have
right,
about
thanks so much.
30 minutes, yeah, and then we'll have discussion.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I'm not going to take anywhere near 30 minutes. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. And I'm really excited about the work that you're doing in the Emancipatory Futures Studies program. Right now, I'm working on a book on solidarity economics, which led me to reach out to Dr. Satgar because he has a really interesting book on the subject. And he asked me to talk about my book on consumerism. And I don't particularly like lecturing. And so I do want to really ask you to be prepared to be in dialogue after I make some introductory remarks. And also, before I forget, I wanted to mention that I'm the co-editor of a book series with Routledge called Bridges to Another World, which is the idea of sort of serious intellectual work, which is accessible, which addresses the questions of how do we get to that other world that we're all hoping for. So I'd love submissions, and if you're interested, you can go to my webpage, which is cynthiakaufman.net, and the call for the book proposals is right at the top there. The other thing I wanted to say is I'm very happy always to share free PDFs, electronic copies of any of my work. Okay, so I wanted to start by just reading a couple chapters of the introduction of the book because it kind of explains what the whole thing is better than I can just do extemporaneously. So just a couple of paragraphs, and then I'm going to just a couple of comments or whatever. Yeah, a little bit of talking. So the book started with me wondering if it was possible to live in a world that was sustainable, given how driven people seem to be towards consumerism. With the urgency of the climate crisis, the dire levels of poverty in the world, and the fact that so many people who consume quite a bit more than they need seem to always want more, I wondered if what would it take to get to a world of enough? Enough for everyone to live well, enough to leave for the environment, and enough for people to ever feel that they had enough. Is it possible to shift our priorities to ensure that all people actually have enough, and to foster the sense that enough is in fact enough? This book argues that the answer to that is yes, that there are plenty of things to meet our needs and to promote happiness to go around for everyone. But there are serious structural barriers to getting to a world of enough. The forces that give resources to those who don't need them, which feed our insatiable hunger for more, are deeply entrenched in human society. Transforming those deeply entrenched systems is not easy, and it requires a tremendous amount of organizing. We'll be better positioned to do that organizing if we understand the forces that we're up against, how they work on people's psyches, and what keeps us from seeing them, and what structural social changes we need to fight for in order to build a society where everyone has enough and also feels that they have enough. We need to transform much in our social systems to get to the point where we can allocate resources such that everyone can have their needs met to increase well-being while also staying within the ecological limits of the planet. Human society is doing an unbelievably bad job of all of that at the present. Tremendous social energy and natural resources are dedicated to the treadmill of conspicuous consumption, which decades of research have shown has no positive impact on how well people are doing. And at the same time, billions of people live in extreme poverty or precariously on the edge of it. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and other ecological crises all require urgent action. So again, the point is what started me on this path was, I live in a very rich country and in a very rich region of a very rich country. And it's shocking to me really how insatiable everybody is. And so I do think we need to deal with that insatiability. And so anyhow, so that sort of drove me to do the research that, all the reading that kind of led to the book. So I would say that some of the most crucial problems of our time can be grouped under the idea of enough. How to assure that everyone has enough for a decent life, how to make sure that people feel that they have enough, and how to leave enough for nature. So those are my kind of three axes of enough. And I actually wanted enough to be the title, but the publisher wanted a title that had more like search words in it. So that's what I ended up with. Okay, so to start with the first axis, which is related to happiness, it's my experience living in, as I already said, a rich region of a rich country, which is full of trauma and unhappiness, that many people feel driven to consume in ways that don't lead to happiness. There's a strong social scientific literature that shows that above a very, very low level of material wealth, more money does not lead to more happiness. And so you find that, for example, Costa Rica, which is a kind of a middle income country, has the same average level of happiness as the United States, with an incredibly much lower level of ecological throughput, and also with much lowers of inequality, which I'll get to in a minute as really crucial to this conversation. But at any given society that has inequality, of course, the rich are happier generally on average than the poor. And so, but if you take society as a whole, more money doesn't lead to more happiness. Which means that a huge amount of economic growth and consumerism have nothing to do with making people better off, and they're a waste ecologically. There are, of course, intense drivers of consumerism that lead many people into an endless treadmill of wasteful consumption and deep feelings of insatiability. You could call that driver capitalism, but I really avoid pretty strenuously talking about capitalism as an agent that makes things happen. And I would say that on the left, there's a tendency to see capitalism as sort of a beast that destroys it, that sort of creates its whole social reality and destroys all attempts to do anything with it. And so as Vish mentioned, my book, Getting Past Capitalism, is kind of a deep dive into the mistakes that the left makes. I think that Marx was like 100% right in his, well, not 100%, but very correct in his critique of capitalism. But the politics that come out of Marxism, I think, lead us in some really bad directions, which is to see, again, capitalism as this sort of this beast that's almost like a monster that makes things happen. And so what I always want to do when I talk about capitalism is to say, what are the processes we're talking about when we talk about capitalism? So, okay, that's a long conversation, so I won't bore you with that, but I would love to talk about that if people want to get into it, because I think it's really important. But we can say that consumerism is fostered by pro-capitalist economics, which is most of the economics that's taught in most of the world, by pro-capitalist practices such as advertising, by devastated communities where people don't have strong relations of meaning and systems of reciprocity, which lead them to get their sense of meaning and values from consumption. And finally, inequality is a huge driver of consumerism. People in unequal societies are insecure about their social positions, and often feel that they need to consume to keep up socially. each of those drivers of consumerism is something that that needs to be fought to get to a world of sustainability. So part of what I'm doing is sort of disaggregating the problem to say, here's all these separate problems, not to make it easy, but to make it simple. In other words, to make it so that we understand what we're up against and we understand the kind of the threads that we need to pursue as organizers. Okay, another axis of enough is the problem of poverty. And solving the problem of poverty, again, is quite simple, even if it's not easy. Basically, the way you solve poverty is you give resources to poor people. So it's really incredibly simple. And you know, if you read the sort of development, you know, what I would call it, the more progressive literature on the so-called development, which I think is a problematic word, but anyway, we'll leave that to the side. But the idea of poverty elimination, that, you know, the transnational institutions all think that economic growth decreases poverty, but of course it doesn't. So if you look at empirical studies of growth, you can see that there are lots of places where increased economic growth does decrease poverty, and plenty of cases where increased economic growth actually increases poverty. So it's a really super tenuous relationship. And so if you want to solve the problem of poverty, you don't go directly towards growth. It's like a side question. Yeah, again, we could talk for a long time about growth. It's, you know, a very problematic concept. I think we all know that. Okay, so but you can eradicate poverty by getting resources to the poor. And of course, there are lots and lots of different ways to get resources to the poor. Taxing the wealthy and redistributing that wealth is in terms of cash, work, food, housing, all of those things work. And of course, we eliminate poverty by creating alternative ways of getting resources, such as creating solidarity projects, as in the work that some of you are doing around the concept of food sovereignty and the work that you're doing with that. Finally, the third axis of enough is sustainability. I myself am very involved in the climate justice movement. And to me, what that means is the part of the climate change movement which is working on taking away the political power of the drivers of the crisis, which most fundamentally is the fossil fuel industry. So I follow an engineer named Mark Jacobson, who's done really interesting work showing that we have all of the technology we need that's at, you know, sort of reasonable prices and reasonable scales, with, you know, the sort of enough minerals to get there if you use your minerals properly, for everybody in the world to have enough. And I think that's an important and to live comfortably, because I know there are many people who are sort of believe that in order, you know, we either need to decrease population, or we need to sort of have less physically comfortable lives to, you know, in other words, to stop having electricity or stop, you know, having air conditioning and things like that to live sustainably. And I actually don't believe that. So that was a big part of the work I did putting this book together, was to kind of pursue that question. And at this point, I believe that, you know, as the population of the world levels off in the next decades, and as if there were not political barriers to rolling out the technology, the sustainable technologies that we already know exist, we can get to a place where everybody in the world has enough, meaning not to live sort of in whatever, you know, gigantic houses and, you know, fly around the world and drive, you know, giant cars all the time. We don't have enough for that, but we have enough for the levels of comfort and the levels of kind of material material living that can make everybody have, you know, very, very good and comfortable lives. I believe that we have all of that. What's keeping us from getting there is the political power, especially of the fossil fuel industry, but also the sort of transnational economic system. So I would say that to solve the sustainability and poverty crisis, we need to solve the inequality crisis. And I do believe that inequality is one of the most pernicious forces in the world today. There's a great book called The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, who argue that a whole host of social problems are actually just side effects of inequality. So, and they look into things like criminality, obesity, teen pregnancy, you know, lots of sort of little, not little, but, you know, very specific social problems that people come up with specific answers to. And what they argue is that that this whole range of social problems actually disappear as you decrease levels of inequality. Yeah, so And there are lots of tools available to deal with inequality. Foremost among them is progressive taxation, and which is, I know, it's kind of a simple, not very inspiring policy solution, but I do believe that is one of the most important things to be working on is forms. And then you could ask the question, well, how do you get to forms of progressive taxation? That what you need is sort of, bottom up democratic movements and social movements to hold states accountable in order to get the kinds of policies that lead to the forms of taxation which shift the distribution of resources. Okay, so by way of conclusion, we get to a world of enough when we fight to ensure that there are systems in place that get resources that people need to live well, when we leave enough for nature, and when we prevent the treadmill that leads to a consumer driven to society which wastes resources while leaving people feeling empty. We get to that world by fighting against pro-capitalist idea systems entrenched in mainstream economics, when we challenge transnational systems that continue to suck resources out of the global south and send them to the wealthy in the global north, and when we push for policies such as progressive taxation to decrease inequality. So that's all I wanted to say, to kind of throw some issues on the table. And I really do love dialogue, so I hope that we're going to open it up that way. And I wonder if it's possible to do this like a Zoom call where everybody's just sort of together and discussing, or if you want to do it more like Q&A. I'm up for either possibility. Sorry, I didn't ask that before.
Thank you, Cynthia. That sets a great basis for the engagements. I think how we'll do it, Charles, I'm not sure how it's all set up on the back end, etc. But I'm going to kick off with a question, Cynthia, and then get you going, and we'll kind of move in that direction. We'll open it up then for another question from the participants. Okay. You engage, and then I'll come back and engage you further. So it'll just roll like that. We've got about 40 minutes or more if we need it. So Cynthia, one of the things that struck me in your book was the notion of happiness, and it kind of sits in this conversation. You didn't say much about it in your opening remarks, but maybe you want to just unpack that a little bit. There's a thing in your book where you says, well, happiness is not the goal. So what are we talking about? Where does it fit in to this conversation?
Yeah, no, thank you for pushing me on that. Yeah, and I actually have been told that happiness is a very weirdly American concept, right? That people in the US are like obsessed with happiness. But there is a whole really interesting transnational academic literature on the concept of happiness. And it's a minimal notion of happiness. It's like the Greek notion of eudaimonia, which basically says like, yeah, things are good. I'm fine. Right? It doesn't mean joy. It doesn't mean exuberance. It doesn't mean that I don't have any problems in my personal life. But what it means is that, like, when you say, like, how's your life? You're like, yeah, my life is good. Right. And I think that's, and the happiness researchers ask those kinds of questions, all in all, are you doing well? There's a whole bunch of different ways of asking that question, but they all boil down to that sort of minimal notion. And yeah, so, but anyhow, what more do you want to hear about that? Or what do you think about that?
No. I think that's great. I mean, I think you cite some other academics, I think, around this being about a way of living. And that's the real thing. Happiness is related to that.
Right.
And I like that. I mean, it connects with Ubuntu and other concepts.
Yeah.
Kind of relational existence, both between people, but also as part of the web of life. That kind of gives us a more textured take on happiness. I mean, there's some interesting stuff in Bhutan and in the Buddhist world as well. I have an academic colleague who's been to Bhutan a few times. We've hosted the Bhutanese at my university because they've institutionalized sort of happiness processes in policy making. There's a forum, there's a metric on happiness, etc., etc. And there is a UN survey on happiness, and I think Finland is the happiest country on planet Earth.
Yeah. And yet Bhutan is right up there too, right? And that says so much about this, and I think you have to say all that because it's like you think about sort of, I mean, I think of kind of capitalist culture as like an addiction, right? Like we just need more, right? So if you're a junkie, like I just need another fix and I'm going to feel good, right? And that's what consumerism does, right? And you know, I live in the midst of it and it's disgusting, right? I mean, there are really people who have so much, you know, will just tear down their houses and rebuild them and spend a year in misery so that they can have a big house so that their friends think that they're successful, right? It's and so the point of most of that happiness literature is to make that distinction between the kind of empty forms of consumerism and the things that actually make people happy, which are about having good relations with others. You know, as you said, yeah, that's sort of Ubuntu concept, that it's about our relations with each other above the certain level of kind of, you know, poverty and misery. You can't sort of minimize
Mm,
the extent to which, you know, there's a book called Donut Economics that I quite like, where
mm,
Kate Raworth says, like, you know, think of the world as like a donut. You need to not be in the hole, which is poverty, but you not to need to be not beyond the donut where you're wasting environmental resources. So you stay in that sweet spot, right? You know, where you get rid of the kinds of poverty which really, you know, destroy people's bodies, and there's just no question that's a problem. But beyond that, people don't need much to be happy, actually.
mm. Great. Let's open this up. Does anybody have a comment or question? This is a dialogue. So yeah, who would want to go? Put up your hands. If you're gonna be shy, I'm just gonna go for it because I want to really engage with Cynthia. Anybody, please put up your hands. So Cynthia, you know, the notion of absolute poverty and
Mhm.
relative poverty is central to
Yeah.
your perspective. And maybe you want to say a little bit more about that. I mean, South Africa is a poster child for inequality in the world. I mean,
Right.
we've had
Yeah.
three decades of ANC rule, and you know, it's become in many ways a perverse society when we
Hmm.
look at it through the lens of inequality. I mean, about 10% of our population have over 70% of national income.
Hmm.
10% have 80% of wealth in this country. It's become more and more concentrated at the top. We've left behind large swathes of our population. And then, of course, you know, grinding it at the bottom of society is this relative and absolute poverty. And
Hmm.
maybe you just want to unpack those concepts and then we
Sure.
can bring in Marcus Solomon into the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, right. So, you know, absolute poverty is what it's almost like biological poverty, you know, like the things that you need, just like enough food, enough sort of medicine, enough warmth, enough cool, you know, that sort of thing, right? That's sort of absolute poverty. But relative poverty is how are you doing within a society? So the example I use in the book is that, during you know, when the pandemic was so serious in this area, I don't like to say it's over because it's not. You know, I work in the Silicon Valley, which anyway, what lots and lots of homeless people, they one of their most serious problems was needing access to places to charge their cell phones. So if you're very poor and living in my area, you kind of need a cell phone to get by. Even just to access services, you need a cell phone. So that would be in the United States, in an urban area. If you don't have a cell phone, you're incredibly poor, right? So that sort of relative poverty has to do with what are the things you need. And actually, even it was, I think it was, anyhow, uh, this idea that poverty, relative poverty, is when you don't have what you need to have to be successful in your society, right? And in every
Mm.
society that's different, but I think that's I find that a really helpful definition. So yeah, and then inequality makes those things different, right? Because if you had a society where uh, the threads of mutuality were really strong, where people depended on one another, where people had access to their basics, and they just had a really good time enjoying each other's company. You wouldn't need cell phones, you wouldn't need entertainment, you wouldn't need, you know, much in the way of clothing. There's all kinds of things you wouldn't need. Many years ago, I spent some time in Cuba and talked to a guy who was a scientist there, who was talking about that they had a long period of very low levels of inequality in Cuba, and people would just go to parties and wear whatever they were wearing, and they'd all have a good time. And then once inequality started creeping back in, all of a sudden you needed more money to have the proper clothes to success socially, right? So relative inequality is like, oh, I need to have some nicer clothes in order to succeed socially.
Interesting. Marcus, please come in.
Vish, thanks again for an access to a wonderful discussion. Now, Marcus Solomon from the Children's Resource Center, and our big mission is to build a movement of children,
Nice.
with agency, etc., etc. Now, this institution or process of consumerism has actually been one of our main points of attention ever since we started 40 years ago, because it became very obvious that children were just after things that someday they can't have, but they desire in the minute they have access to resources. But it's also a big motive, by the way. And I just had a discussion in the Crime Crisis Coalition. And the point you made earlier on, Cynthia, about the crime is the side effects of inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important, because what happens is the gangsters and they thrive because what the kids don't have, they then offer that we will make it sure that you get what you need, desire.
Right.
But the very disastrous impact of the advertisement industry, they've changed the eating habits of almost 40% of the world's population. I think my maths are right. It's about 3 billion people. KFC, Nando's, etc., have changed the eating habits. And a very interesting study done by the Children's Institute, a very interesting office, parts of the medical school of the University of Cape Town. They've shown that, and of course, other food scientists, that the food industry is actually poisoning people. Diabetes, sugar, high blood pressure is because of the food we eat. And of course, with our little small efforts to develop this food sovereignty campaign, little gardens, don't seem to really have a chance about, but we'll continue to try. But the point I mean is that we need then, and my basic call is that we really need to also begin to work in a much more meaningful way, building, besides the unions and women's movement, the children's movement, where we can begin to hopefully make some impact. And in our little website, the children's movement, we've shown there is a small impact that we are beginning to notice. Now, scientists will say no, but there's very anecdotal stuff and so on, and we will agree to that. But the thing is, we've had some kitchens, and children go back to what they used to eat. Because some people say they just want meat, and it's not true necessarily. Of course, there is now, children don't want meat now. They want the meat, Nando's, etc. I'm rambling a bit, but thank you very much. But the point I want to make is that we need also to begin to address with the advertisement industry, the food industry, the clothing industry are targeting small children with this consumerism. And they've really won over huge sections of our communities here. Sorry about that.
No, I really appreciate what you're saying, and it's profound and moving and so interesting to hear what anti-consumerism looks like from your perspective working in South Africa. I think it's really interesting. And what I would say too, I'm actually quite curious about, I guess what I want to say is that it seems to me that, that there are the things you can do, like like in Mexico, they're now taxing sugary drinks, right? And which has made a huge difference. And then there's, things that people do to sort of outlaw. In the United States, you can no longer advertise sugary cereals to children during the morning, what used to be the morning children's television time, right? So there are those sort of like large scale policy things. But then there are this sort of, Gramsci's idea of hegemony, the idea that there's sort of like, becomes a sort of dominant cultural set of expectations, which everybody accepts as normal, right? This sort of consumerism, KFC is better, all that sort of thing. And that one of the ways you fight that is by creating counter hegemony, so sort of alternative cultures. And, you mentioned that, like, people work in these gardens and they have these wonderful experiences and then they go back. It's because then they're swimming in the sea of this other dominant culture. And I'll tell you, I have a son who's 22, and we live in a kind of a wealthy-ish, suburban-ish place. And, I was sort of losing my child really to the Apple Corporation, right? He was just like sort of, obsessed with those kinds of things. And I sent him to a summer camp that was sort of a hippie summer camp, right? Where it was all about, circus arts and community and alternative ways of thinking and living. And he came back from there completely transformed and is now very much an alternative thinking person. And I do think, and so I wonder what you're doing. So this is a question really back to you, is what do you do to create kind of those alternative systems of meaning, alternative cultures that the young people can live in and sort of reinforce each other's values, right? Because I think that's what it takes is places where people get their alternative values reinforced and aren't constantly bombarded with this idea of, you're a failure if you don't eat these foods and wear these clothes.
Could I go, Fish?
Yeah, quickly. Yes,
okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we need also to build the alternative now. In fact, many years ago, one of our major unions had this slogan: socialism is the future, build it now. The thing is, what we've saying, we claim that that is why the movement is important, because we are street-based, and we say, we're going to drink less Coke, for example. When we have our functions, no Coke, and we can live, if you want, maybe let's say, and we've discussed it, let's reduce the Coke drinking by 50%. The sugar, because children say, when we say, look, this is what your mommy, what we ask, for example, children, how many parents have diabetes? Most of them put up their hands most times. You know what? Because we didn't control the eating of sugar when we were at this age.
Right.
No. So it can be done, and on a small scale, we've shown it can be done with the gardens, but particularly with the sugar. We're part of a food coalition, and they're trying to get the state and the big companies to reduce the sugar. Research has shown it has been done, but in the movement, you can begin to say, because you also have a control over the resources then. We're not going to buy 10 bottles of Coke. Let's agree how much less. So there's a participatory process. So the movement then becomes the base where you begin the alternative. So the movement building is part of community building, part of building the alternative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, before I bring in Scott, I just want to just exhaust the analysis a little bit more. I mean, we always jump to what the answers are, which is really cool. But, I want to talk a little bit more about unhappy societies. I want to talk a little bit more about unequal societies. And, you mentioned inequalities tied to a lack of trust in your book. Okay, trust breaks down. And I think this is a big deal for us in South Africa. We have a deeply unhappy society. We have a deeply unequal society. Trust is breaking down at all levels of this country, okay? We're in a crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. And for me, it's kind of, where does that go? I think that's my question. And, the US also is a highly discontented society. So maybe from where you're sitting, Cynthia, you can say a little bit about where is that discontent, that unhappiness, that lack of enough, where is it taking society?
it's taking us to fascism at this point. Okay, I mean, we're having this conversation at a truly terrifying point in the United States, right, where we really are facing the idea of electing a fascist dictator. And I think, that sort of that lack of trust makes people incredibly manipulable by demagogues, right? Because and you sort of don't trust. And I do think that we should not underestimate how terrible social media is. I think I go back and forth and how, that people get their information, in the most ridiculous of ways. And so it's really easy at this point. We're in an incredible crisis of, Bruno Latour calls it an epistemological crisis, right? A crisis of sort of like who believes what's true, and what are the ways that you even can possibly wade your way through all of that complexity and know what's true, where people are incredibly manipulable. So I mean, I think, we're at a I tend to be very utopian, right? And so much of my work is like, I can see that other world and let's get there and here's what we do to get there. But the moment we're in, as the climate crisis intensifies and more people experience disaster and more systems break down, the vulnerability to fascism just increases that much. So that's where I think we're at. That's where I think we're at.
Sure, and I think that that kind of pattern is emerging here as well. That kind of inclination. I want to bring Scott in. Scott, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia, as you know, we both have spent decades living in Silicon Valley. So I
Oh,
think my
hi, Scott.
question and my question goes along exactly the threads that we've been following. I wanted you to speak more. You've already started about the role of Silicon Valley. I've been pondering myself, like, what happened to this place that we kind of grew up in that gave birth to the Grateful Dead, the Whole Earth Catalog, Joan Baez, all of that. I mean, it was, and community colleges, by the way, where we both work, where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak dropped out of elitist universities and colleges to come to our community colleges because they were free, because they had more services and more resources. And now, so we had a kind of communitarian spirit there, exactly in Silicon Valley. And in my lifetime, I now would argue that it is the #1 exporter of not enough. I mean, I really think that I've accidentally grown up and lived and spent my entire adult life in the epicenter of the crisis. Of course, it goes
Yeah,
all the way back to classical economics, which is the other place that's not enough, right? Like classical economics is based on the
right,
concept of scarcity.
right.
Fundamentally, that's its fundamental axiom is scarcity. But I wanted more of your
Mhm.
perspective on what the hell happened to Silicon Valley. Did we create it? Was it imposed? Was it bought off? Like, what's your kind of idea of the genesis of not enough within Silicon Valley? Because now we are the broadcast central propaganda for the entire world for not enough, including our insane billionaires, right? The
Yeah.
Elons, the Elons and the Peter Thiels and everyone else who are supporting Trump to the hilt.
Yeah, maybe you just dropped a bomb in the Silicon Valley, the problem would go away, right?
Yeah.
So, no, but you know what I'll say? So there's a wonderful, and of course, most people here are not from, don't care as much about the Silicon Valley as we do. But I will say there's a fantastic book called Palo Alto. It's a 700-page history written by a leftist historian that does what you're saying, Scott, right? Which was sort of like looks at the sort of the current crisis in neoliberal capitalism and how much of its roots are actually at Stanford University of all places, right? And that was a particular place where a certain form of kind of techno entrepreneurialism was developed. So the idea of yeah, techno entrepreneurialism kind of says what I'm trying to say, and then the libertarian politics, right? The sort of politics of no regulation, of do whatever you want, nobody gets to tell you what to do. That yeah, I mean, I think it's what can I say? Yeah, and I don't think it's the sort of the kind of hippie alternative culture that you refer to are in any way, shape, or form part of the problem. It's just that there's this other thing that's also California is sort of famous for being two things, right? It's the place where lots of wonderful alternative accepting things happen, and it's also the place where Nixon and Reagan and the military industrial complex in Silicon Valley are. So we are both of those things.
Great. I mean, I'll just throw in something until someone puts up their hand. So in the book, you also mention, the sort of rise of like status consciousness and, where social thought, maybe before Marx and Rousseau, had very different conceptions of what society should be all about and so on. And then Marx and Rousseau critique, what was emerging. And then suddenly we have this shift with capitalism, towards being obsessed with consumption, status, class, etc. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? So, we put
Sure.
that.
Yeah, just that the sort of I mean, one of the things that if you grew up bathed in neoclassical economics and kind of pro-capitalist ways of thinking, you start by assuming that people are greedy and self-interested, and that's what human nature is, right? And I think that it's that conversation about human nature is important, and to say that we are fundamentally social creatures and we get our sense of meaning and purpose from the communities in which we live, and that most human societies have had some kinds of stories that they tell themselves about the antisocial nature of avarice, right? You go back to like the story of King Midas, right? It's just, it's a classic old story about, if you're greedy, you want everything to be gold, then all of a sudden all of your family members turn to gold and all of a sudden you can't talk to them anymore, right? So that idea that it's not that capitalism invented greed. It's that what a kind of a pro-capitalist culture does is it glorifies greed and then gets rid of the kind of regulators on greed. So that I do think that a lot of the problem it has to do with our idea systems, right? And the sort of the idea systems that glorify greed, and so that part of our work then as social change agents is to challenge those narratives, right? And to bring back narratives. And that's why, like, the idea of enough, like the part of the point of the book is bringing back the narrative that that enough is enough and I'm just fine, thank you very much, I don't need more. But part of what drives consumerism, all the things we've talked about, advertising, all these things for sure, and also just that basic kind of set of cultural values.
Great. Anybody else wants to engage? Whose hands are up here? Comments, questions? We're trying to figure this thing out. Yes,
Yeah,
Syed, Shop. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Syed. Syed. Charles, can you activate this person? Syed, and then soon.
looks like he's on mute.
Syed, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you now, please.
Okay, great. I'm Sir Jawad Shah. I'm from Pakistan. Okay, and I mean, I have been engaged in reading philosophy and even Cynthia's book about these radical ideas for change. And ever since I've been, reading her stuff, but I've been also very much, distressed about what's the future of this country. So I like, it's everyday struggle. Like, okay, right now I have to attend Cynthia's, this conversation that I have to take, but simultaneously I've also to do other things as well. Just to keep pace with my excellence and everything, because everything is like falling apart right here, because takes are getting worse and worse. Not like Cynthia talked about this progressive takes. Okay, let's talk about it now here, the progressive, like in America, like in Pakistan, even third world, there's a dominoes effect. What happens in the first world, I don't know, there's something neurosis in this countries. Okay, so they follow that thing. Like, I don't know, there's sort of the colonization is still going on inside the people's mind. Okay, decolonization, this guy French Fanon talked about, it needs violent effect. Okay, now this violence, how you going to project violence? Okay, so this is, I mean, these are very complicated things that, I mean, even he cannot answer it properly, because so I don't know, it's like I don't know, whenever I talk on this complex issue, I guess, drenched in other things as well. So, I mean, so it's an everyday struggle.
Mhm.
And so thing is that you want to do things for, to aid purpose to your life, but you cannot do it because you don't get ample time for it. By the, you just get up for your work, and it's over, and you again sleep again. It's a vicious cycle things going on. Taxations, it happens on me, obviously, like the mediocre people have to burn the beer of the taxations. Okay, now the obviously the the elites one, obviously get rid of it, and always, because like you talked about the Gramscian thing. Okay, now Gramscian thing also, the Gramsci talk about, there's also superstructures like the enactment of the laws.
Mhm.
Okay, enactment of the law is a part of the Gramscian hegemony part. Okay, now through that they can create that hegemony. They can propose any tax they want to propose. Okay, we cannot do nothing until like the masses are mobilized. But masses are like, because they have turned masses into zombies. They
Mhm.
talk about every struggle. No, we have to buy the wheat, we have to buy the fresh, the fresh water for it. The fresh water is getting expensive. I don't know. It's like, the word is, I don't know. It's. I used to be, a very positive kind of guy, but now the climate thing is also worsening everything.
Mm.
Food crisis. I'm like, I own some lands, but they're like, I cannot sow them. Like I cannot, bear the burden of that huge economics that I have to put into my lands, because I don't know how the scientists going to predict that the monsoons are getting whether worse or not. Okay, like in 2020, the whole Pakistan was flooded. I mean, from north to south, it was like, it was, catastrophic.
Yeah.
Nothing was, nothing survived. Nothing survived. So I mean, even the Dane owners who were like filthy rich, even they, they were totally, got what you call it. Oh, okay, I'm like missing the word. So I mean, what was my? Yeah, I want to talk about this idea of happiness as well. The purpose of capitalism is also, this create this insatiability as well.
Mhm.
Okay, you need more. Like I want to give example of Zizek, Slavoj Žižek, this philosopher. He said, the Coca-Cola, you want to have a sip of it, you want to sip, and again, because it has some ingredients, you want to sip more. Again, it's like that. Okay, and also I like his idea about surplus happiness as well, like the Marxian idea of the surplus value. Okay, now a simple t-shirt who has a logo of Nike, but when I meet to my peers and when I go into the society out there, I feel so much different. I feel more than a person, because I'm having, but little I know that it is made by a labor.
Mhm.
It is made by labor who lives in the slums.
Right.
I mean, this is something hidden from the people's eye.
Mhm.
And when we told them, they are so much detached. I mean, so we can talk about other things as well, like even the food they put on the billboards or whatever it is. They are all like in America. I'm Cynthia talking about your American thing. Okay, now FDA have characterized them, the fast food thing, as the first carcinogenic thing, but they are still selling it. Even Europeans are doing that. Why not to stop it? This is more than, I mean, this is insane. It's more than insane.
Yeah.
And they are
So,
like, again,
so let's get Cynthia to respond, and then
I'm
we'll
sorry,
give
I
somebody
don't
else a
know.
chance as well.
I'm sorry.
Sunil
Yeah,
has
thank
his
you,
hand
thank
up.
you, thank you, thank you very much.
Okay,
And
Cynthia.
thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate your perspective. I feel like there's a lot in what I'm hearing in what you're saying is that sense of overwhelm with just, this is sort of monstrous capitalist culture and capitalist practices everywhere, and the climate crisis everywhere, right? And so then when we get to that feeling of overwhelm, I think it's always important to then come back to the idea of praxis, right? And the idea of the sort of, what are we going to do about it? And I know for myself, in my climate book, The Sea is Rising and So Are We, I have a whole chapter on kind of climate grief and what to do with our sense of kind of living a life well in the face of the disasters that we're facing. And I think that I know for me, my biggest form of therapy is being involved in movement. And one of my favorite slogans is, to change everything, start anywhere. And the idea that, I was talking to a young man I know who, anyway, there are sometimes when people sort of imagine, like, where's the revolution? And I want to be part of it. And I want to be a leader in that revolution. And I want to put out the idea of us as ants, right? We're all ants. And the metaphor that I always use, that Vish referred to earlier, sort of, we're reweaving the social fabric. We want to reweave it as deeply as possible, but that we're always all in it, and we're always all doing things, and we live our life best when we see ourselves as part of the solution. So one of the things that happens to me in my teaching a lot is that I get students who sort of grew up thinking the world is fine, but they must be, the misery must be because their parents didn't work hard enough or something like that, right? So that they know that there's misery, but they blame themselves and their family, and they assume that the world as it is fine. And when I start to teach them about the sort of deep systemic nature of race, racism and capitalist processes and patriarchy and all those things, they come to a point of feeling devastated and despairing. And one of my solutions to that is to remind us all that we are part of a team of millions all over the world who are doing this work. And for me, it's really lovely to be here with all of you in a global conversation, to realize that many of us think sort of the same way, and we're on the same side, and we're pushing in the same ways. And we've had many, many victories, and those victories come in small ways, right? And it's about like the work of ants of kind of, undermine, right? And you move grains of sand, and then all of a sudden something falls, and you never know when something is going to fall. So I think it's really important for each person's own sanity to do their work. In other words, to be the ant doing whatever you can wherever you are that is sustainable for you personally, and then to, in your mind, fantasize, conceptualize, imagine that work that you're doing as part of a global network of millions of people around the world.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Sunil, you had your hand up. I'd like to bring you in, and then we can wrap up. I might have one more question for Cynthia. Sunil, you kept on coming in and out. You had your hand up. Sunil? Sunil, are you there?
Good evening, Vishwas. Hi, Cynthia. Firstly, my appreciation for providing us with access to Cynthia and this wonderful opportunity to engage on the issues which she's been speaking so eruditely on. Very quickly from my side, two issues. The one is the role of human agency. How do we start effecting the kind of critical intervention within our school curriculum to ensure that happiness, sustainability, and this critical consciousness that we make reference to becomes part of the school curriculum and are issues which learners can readily identify with as part of this counter-hegemonic thrust. That's the first issue. The second issue is right at the outset, you said almost as a kind of disclaimer that we want to extricate this broad issue from the capitalist beast. But I think it's important for us to reiterate that it's part of the capitalist beast, because the inherent risk of us trying to remove it from this capitalist monstrosity is that we see it in a kind of almost esoteric way, so that it becomes a social construct which is highly individualized, and the notion of human agency at a collective mass-based level can in fact be negated. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, first, the school thing. Yeah, in the United States right now, there's a huge struggle going on about curriculum in schools, right? And in California, a lot of people worked hard to have it be that everybody needs to learn ethnic studies. So they need to learn about, sort of issues of race, ethnicity, and identity in their high schools, which I think is great, right? And then in the state of Florida, you have people saying you can't talk about the history of slavery because it will make white people feel guilty. So, that we have both extremes really fighting over the school curriculum. And I'll just say that I think that it's an important site of struggle, and then to transition to your second point, and I think a huge important site of struggle that needs more, what we need to do more around it is the challenges in the discipline of economics, right? As Scott mentioned, that so much of my work is about is a challenge to the assumptions, because so many of these sort of pro-capitalist ways of thinking about the world are propagated as a kind of pseudoscience from the discipline of economics. And so sort of, and then it has all this legitimacy. We were working on rent control in my little town, and, people would say in response, well, any idiot knows, anyone who takes economics 101 knows that it's an issue of supply and demand. And the reason rents are high is because there's just not enough supply. So we need to build more, which of course isn't true. The rents are high because there's too much speculative capital in, but people sort of take it as just a basic common sense, these ridiculous and absurd things that they learn in economics classes. So struggles over curriculum are super important. Okay, and then thank you for bringing up my capitalist beast concept, because it is one of my kind of, what can I say, one of my most core kind of concepts that I really think is important to talk about. So I'm not saying that capitalism isn't a beast, but what I am saying is that when you say capitalism did this, capitalism did that. So there's some thinkers, there's a pseudonymous author, so it's two people, but they go by the title of J.K. Gibson Graham, whose work has been really foundational for me. And what they argue is that more than half of the things that we consume are created outside of capitalism. So you think about domestic labor, which is incredibly important, and also cooperatives, and also the economic work done by the state. I work at a community college. That's a state-run institution, right? People get taxed. I think of that as socialism. People get taxed, the state makes decisions through a democratic process somewhat, and then decides to distribute resources. So if you think about what I would call a kind of state-run socialism, domestic labor, communal labor, all those things, that actually is more of what we consume in the world comes from that than from capitalism. So, and then also, it's not like, because if you think that capitalism is a thing which has agency and does, I'm so sorry, people are doing work outside of my house, so I hope the noise isn't too bad. But anyway, that capitalism does these things, and the only way to stop it is to sort of overthrow capitalism. You then make the problem sort of bigger and more unsolvable than it is. And that's why so much of my work is about disaggregating, right? Let's say, so as we were talking about the children's work, it's like, okay, there's the problem of advertising. We know how, and again, a lot of what I say in this consumerism book is that what I'm talking about is simple, but not easy, right? Simple, in other words, we simply need to tax the rich. We simply need to regulate advertising. We simply need more democracy in our systems. So each of those things is something which is understandable, which all of us can, as part of social movements in an ant-like way, be the Lilliputians who hold Goliath down, right? That's how I imagine social change. Whereas so many anti-capitalists imagine the way we fight capitalism is through a revolution, which and what they imagine a revolution is really just a coup d'etat, right? It's just a sort of a small group of people take state power, which is not a revolution because you haven't deeply transformed society. So there's so much in anti-capitalist thinking which is stuck in a very narrow, old-fashioned, and really, I would say, politically completely irrelevant way of thinking about how about what the fight is that we're up against.
Thank you. So I'm going to pitch one last thing to you, Cynthia, so you have the last word. I'm not a sort of apocalyptic type when it comes to climate, or kind of adherent to catastrophism and so on. But, when you just think about the rise of Trump and some of the modeling that's been done around the different factions inside the Republican Party and their positions with the fossil fuels, it's clear that all three factions that make up that party want to accelerate fossil fuels if he comes
Yeah.
back to power.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to think about, your ant metaphor and that. And, how do we also subjectively keep our optimism, our joy alive,
Yeah.
and also, transform as we struggle? Because this is
Yeah.
also a challenge to the left. I think feminism has helped us bring that front and center. Some indigenous ecologies have helped us bring that front and center. And because the old revolutionary model is, well, you this masculinist kind of tough male type, and that you on this march of history, blah, blah, and you have all the answers. But yet there's other left orientations that help us kind of think about simple things like joy and being present in the world, etc.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in the light of this kind of big climate problem, any thoughts to leave us with around, how we can be
Yeah.
enough in our activism, enough
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. But I
in
will
our
say that
struggle. Yeah.
you just threw me about 10 really interesting things. Okay. So first off, enough in our struggle. I mean, a lot of my praxis at work is working with, people in the sort of 18 to 25 age range who are just coming to political consciousness. And one of the things I always say to them is, I want you in this struggle when you're my age, which means you have to pace yourself, right? So, in other words, because again, and when I was a young revolutionary, right, and I was like, wanting to, and I had decided that I needed an education, and somebody in the movement actually said to me that that was bourgeois, and that if I really cared about the revolution, I wouldn't go to school. And I thought, well, I actually need to go to school to get a job because I am not independently wealthy, and so the idea of sort of taking care of business in your life, meaning sort of, your fundamentals of your material existence, but also your joy, your happiness, your relationships, all those things. And I agree with you that I feel like there is a left emerging everywhere that I go, and with, sort of all the people that I quite like. And I think it's for me, a really important touchstone is the Zapatistas in Mexico. I think that they put out some ideas, again, bringing sort of indigeneity into it, feminism into it, these ideas that our understanding of what we're doing is not the heroic masculinist revolutionary. It is about us caring about ourselves, about our relationships with one another, about our joy in the process. And then to go super negative, I mean, I really do think that if Trump is elected, it's game over for the climate. I do. And the ant work, like there's a lot of us working really, really hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. And one of the things that I'll say is that everybody I know in this country who's engaged with this election, we're not even engaged with the question of, will Joe Biden stay in and what's going on there. I mean, it's a terrible, frightening thing that's going on with the Democratic Party. But I send my money to organizations that fund grassroots groups working in low-income communities of color in swing states, right? So the idea is you're going to do good work anyway with those folk, building relationships, building capacity. You fund organizers, you don't fund advertising. And that even something as terrible as the US election, it actually is won through ant work. That's what I want to say. Then the other thing is that I want to maybe just end, because I think hope matters. I do think that if the United States comes through this election, well, I mean, people don't know. Joe Biden did a lot for the climate, right? I mean, he did a tremendous amount actually for the climate, and things are really turning around in this country. And I'm not a big fan of the corporate Democratic Party, but it was because of the grassroots work that made Bernie Sanders so strong, that then forced, and all that grassroots work in those communities, that made it such that Biden had to govern in a quite decent way. He cut the child poverty rate in half in his first 2 years in office. So there's, so anyway, blah, blah, about all those things. But what I want to say about the climate is that the transition is happening. We're in the middle of a tremendous transition. It is, there were, I think it was 8 days this spring where California, the state of California, which is, I believe, the 5th largest economy in the world, was completely on renewable energy for 8 days. So, and you have whole countries in Northern Europe that have made the transition. And so what I'm saying is that the transition is happening. It's actually happening very rapidly. Renewables are coming on at just a remarkable speed. So the question is, can that happen fast enough without the fossil fuel industry and all of their corporate allies destroying it? And I have no idea how this story ends. We are living through a thriller. We are living through a thriller. And we don't know if it's an American thriller with a happy ending or if it's a Russian thriller with a sad ending. We have no idea, right? We just have no idea. And all we can do is do our best because we're people in that story.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for your wisdom, your insights, your intellectual positions and engagements. This was enough to get us to reach for more. I think that's what's
Yes.
exciting. Yes. So thank you to everybody else who also participated. The wonderful comments, engagements, questions, etc. All of this now is documented. It's been recorded, and we'll be sharing this recording with everybody in our network. So please use it to stimulate more engagements, more conversations on this very, very important question about how we lead our lives and how do we be, if you like, content beings. Thank you, Cynthia, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Vish and others. Bye.